Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the fall season of ALOUD. I'm Jessica Strand, the Senior Director of Programs and Strategic Engagement at the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. ALOUD is off to a wonderful start. Last week we had Jasmine Ward. This week, Edwidge Danticat and Robin Coste Lewis. And in the coming weeks, an exciting list of programs which include, to name just a few, celebrated actors reading from banned books, an afternoon in Grand Park where we'll bring the Library of America's new anthology, Latino Poetry, Places We Call Home, to life with readings and music from renowned Latin writers and musicians to an afternoon with Yuval Sharon. Please join us to learn more about the season. Visit lfla.org/ALOUD. And before I say more, I want to mention a special library festival, the 6th Annual Los Angeles Libros Festival, on Saturday, September 28th from 10 to 4. This is a day of entertainment featuring Spanish language and bilingual storytelling, musical performances, authors, workshops, and books. Now, for those not familiar with the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, we are a private nonprofit organization devoted to fundraising, advocacy, and innovative program in support of the Los Angeles Public Library. Thank you to the Library Foundation supporters and members who are with us this evening. If you are not yet a member or supporter, I hope you will consider supporting the Library Foundation to continue to see more programs like this one and to increase critical access to information, resources, and technology to help Angelenos improve their lives and fulfill their dreams. You can support us with a donation or by joining. So here you go, right here. Makes it very easy. I'd also like to thank our sponsors this evening, Aaron Fox Schiff, Deloitte, the Golden Globe Foundation, Stephen and Judith Krantz Foundation, the Los Angeles County Department of Arts and Culture, the National Endowment for Humanities, Sharon Oxborough Endowed Fund for ALOUD, Peck Endowment for Cultural Programs, Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, and of course, all of the individual Library Foundation donors and members. For tonight's program, I'm very excited and pleased to have two extraordinary writers, Edwidge Danticat and Robin Coste Lewis, on our stage this evening. I spent years in cultural programming and have not had the pleasure of presenting Edwidge Danticat at a program I organize, so I'm extra pleased to have her this evening with her moving and deeply thoughtful book of essays, We're Alone. Danticat is a writer of many genres whose work delves with tender insight and intensity into the complexities of the immigrant experience, as well as giving us an education and better understanding of Haiti and its people. Her language and grace in constructing a clear, vivid picture and close feel of a place, emotion, person, and object, regardless of the genre in which she writes, reveals a world that might only be seen from a distance if it were not Danticat's brilliance in making all come to life. We're Alone moves effortlessly between personal narrative, reportage, and tributes to her mentors to create a thoughtful and provocative book of essays. These essays make us each think more deeply about the world we live in and the tragedies and complexities of our history and of our present time. Becca Rothfield says beautifully in her review in the Washington Post of Danticat's book, quote, like the informal but spirited orators she grew up idolizing, Danticat cultivates a style that is diverting and digressive. Her essays are not linear artifacts, but webs that spin around ideas or turns of phrase. As such, they are never about one thing. Rothfield continues by saying, appropriately, We're Alone is an ambivalent declaration. It is the persistent chorus of the deserted, Danticat writes, but it is also, quote, a promise writers make to their readers, a reminder of this singular intimacy between us, a writer and reader alone together. Edwidge Danticat is an author of numerous books, most recently before We're Alone, the story collection Everything Inside, winner of the Boca Fiction Prize, the Story Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Fiction Prize, The Art of Death, another title, National Book Critics Circle finalist in criticism. Her novels include Breath, Eyes, Memory, an Oprah Book Club selection, Crick Crack, a National Book Award finalist, The Farming of the Bones, an American Book Award winner. Her memoir, Brother, I'm Dying, was the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award and a finalist for the National Book Award. Among other awards, she has received a MacArthur Fellowship, the Neustadt Prize, and the Vilseek Prize. She will be in conversation with Robin Coste Lewis, who has won the National Book Award for Voyage of the Sable Venus, her first collection of poetry. The book was also a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. And it was named one of the best books of the year by the New Yorker and the New York Times. Literary Hub named it one of the best books of the last 20 years. She is also the co-author with Kevin Young of Robert Rauschenberg's 34 illustration for Dante's Inferno. Lewis is also the former Poet Laureate of Los Angeles. Her work has appeared in various journals and anthologies, including the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Paris Review, Transition, and the Massachusetts Review. Please put your hands together and welcome Edwidge Danticat and Robin Coste Lewis. Thank you very much.
Hello. Just turn this on. Oh, thank you. I'm so honored to be here to talk to you, Edwidge, and I'm so honored to be in this theater. It's such a special place. It really is. It has such profound history. The first time I was here was for Wanda Coleman's memorial. So every time I walk in here, I remember that, and Edwidge and I are both huge poetry fans. So I'm just gonna jump in, okay? But hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. And can you believe we get to have Edwidge? I'm so excited. So the first journal of African-American poetry in the United States was titled Les Senelles. It was published in French in 1845 in New Orleans by free people of color. Louisiana and Haiti have a long, glorious and tragic history, so much so that the Creole spoken in Louisiana and the Creole spoken in Haiti sounds very similar, which is all to say, Edwidge, all our migrational roots come together in this hearty welcome to LA. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you.
Right? I'm so just thrilled. And I'm also really deeply honored to be here with you on the publication of your new book, We're Alone. A deceptively, look at this, you guys, deceptively small book that is vast, deep, solid, and throws a lot of arrows and a lot of heft, right? That's skill. That's skill. But here's my disclaimer. If you hail from anywhere, any old world culture in the world, but especially the African diaspora, we know that 45 minutes, the time allotted for us today, is only long enough to say hello. So I'm having a really hard time, but we're going to use these minutes well, I hope, and I hope to discuss the rigorous and elegantly written work at hand. We're Alone. Anybody read it yet? Okay, great. This is fantastic. We're Alone is a collection of 8 taut, sophisticated essays that excavate the transgenerational realities of what it means to be born in a nation where the collision of culture and power is so evident that even nature itself participates. Like the sea, this book's power is quiet, certainly, but also like the sea, don't you dare turn your back on it. Layered within its dark intimacies are climate collapse in the form of hurricanes, earthquakes, outbreaks of diseases that kill thousands, hundreds of thousands, and the ongoing repercussions of such devastation due to the negligence of the international community and NGOs. Quotidian police brutality, Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima, the history of the US occupation of both the Dominican Republic and Haiti, the ongoing appalling treatment of Haitians by the DR, gun violence and mass shootings, Trump's brutal back-turning of 200,000 Haitians in Florida, the way certain worlds turn their heads and walk away from black bodies year after year, century after century, but nevertheless still demands that a nation pays what Danticat and a friend calls a ransom for their own independence. There is also a river of quiet pride, the pride that comes from being from a country whose independence in 1804, 60 years before slavery ended in the United States, shook the entire colonial world, inspiring hundreds of other independence movements even to this day. And this book is also about writing itself as a refuge and harbor, and how other writers, Morrison, Marshall, Hansberry, Lord, Garcia Marquez, Baldwin, were the places you landed, aesthetically and intellectually, to steel yourself and your country against the myths of histories. So please, whatever you do tonight, do yourself a favor and read this book. So let's begin, even though I want to say hello for a long, long, long time. How's your mother? How's your grandmother? How's your... You say that you always wanted to be a writer in this book since you were a child. So let's start there, Edwidge. What was it about language that captivated you? Why words and stories, for example?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say thank you to Robin, and thank you to all of you, to the library and the folks here for having us. What captured me about language initially, like first, for as long as I could remember, was hearing stories. That oral tradition that you mentioned that had its own inner poetry. The adults in my life, so my parents, my mother left, my father left Haiti when I was 2, my mother when I was 4, so I grew up with this extended family, and there were a lot of children like us in this household. And the adults were very strict, very rigid, and the only time that they seemed to come to life, and the only glimpse I would get of their childhood was when they were telling stories. And there was a ritual to it, there was a connection to it. You weren't even supposed to look at adults in the eye, that was considered disrespectful, but when they were telling the stories, they were lively, and if you seemed bored, they would start a song. There was a kind of, there was a rhythm to it that was so beautiful. So I would watch that, and it was like a performance, and I thought, I want to do that, but I was a shy girl, I was in the corner, I was enjoying, but I never saw my role as participating. And then I remember when I was 4 years old, my uncle gave me that book, the Madeleine book in the house in Paris that was covered with vines in French. Yes. And I thought, oh, this is really, really cool. First of all, they were little girls whose parents you didn't know where they were, which was our case. And I thought, this is really interesting because this is kind of like what my aunts are doing, but I can be in the corner alone with this, whoever's telling me the story. So that's really when I started thinking, oh, there's different ways of using language to tell a story. And I was like, I think the one I can do, given my personality, was the one where you're alone with the page. I didn't know how you would get there, but I thought, okay, if I can do what they're doing, speaking, and I can do it on paper, that's what I'll try to do.
I think it's such a fascinating thing to contemplate, how a human being goes to language as opposed to image, as opposed to sound, as opposed to engineering or math or whatever. It's just fascinating. So you begin the book with an exquisite poem titled Shore in English, from which you take your title. Can you tell us a little bit about the poem and the history of the author? What made you decide to choose this title?
So in the 1990s, I used to work for a filmmaker named Jonathan Demme, and I was in the office, I did all things like Haiti. He went to Haiti, did documentaries in Haiti, and he also had a very large collection of older Haitian writers that people knew who were like vintage writers, had vintage collections. And once for my birthday, he gave me this book, The Poets of Haiti, from like the 17, it was just like a big range, like for a century. And I started reading them. They were translated by this woman who was a writer from Maine. And I actually came across her name in a book about the Harlem Renaissance. I was like, that woman was there, was in Harlem too. And she was kind of one of those people, and she went to Haiti. She collected these poems, translated them, and got the president of Haiti to write her introduction. And he said some wonderful things, and she does this whole history of like the black genius. And I started reading the poems, and I thought, and then there were some that I already knew the writers, like I already knew, Jacques Romain, who wrote a book called Masters of the Dew that was translated by Langston Hughes. So yeah, so I already knew some of them, but then the Chassagne, I came across, and I was like, we're alone, and for some reason, I landed there and kind of stayed there. And then I bought it's an older book, it's never been reprinted, and I always like try to get a copy when I can. And I was like, oh, it'd be so great to know what he actually wrote, because it mentioned that it was from a book called, Le Veil Tambourine, Le Tambourine Voilé. And finally it occurred to me, I was like, he is the grandfather of Régine Chassagne, who is the singer in this rock group called Arcade Fire. And I know Régine. I was like, how come I never thought to ask Régine? And I asked her, and then she put me in touch with her dad. And then it turned out Roland Chassagne was arrested because he was working in a press, and he was arrested for having what then during the dictatorship was called contraband literature. And he died in Fort Dimanche, which is a dungeon prison, and they never saw him again. And I thought, it just reminded me again, because I always go back a lot to these writers who sort of faced the dictatorship, but of how, that same idea, you could be alone with a writer when they've passed on, right? In that they can die, but the words remain as it did with the Chassagne.
Yeah. It's a beautiful poem. You said backstage you might want to read. Do you want to read some of that, or do you want to read something else?
Yeah, I'll read a little bit of that so the folks get
Fantastic.
a taste of
En français et en anglais, or?
Well, je vais essayer. So I'll do a little bit in French, and then in the Edna Worthley Underwood translation. So, plage. Nuit, bercement mélancolique des palmes, tu chantes ta voix fragile, s'évanouit loin sur les plages du silence. Nuit, le vent est d'une l'odeur fraîche, derrière moi j'ai refoulé toutes mes rancœurs, et tu sais que ma vie est une allée solitaire que seul tu longes. Night, the cradling of palms, you sing, your frail voice faints afar, where the sands of silence are. Night, heavy, heavy the wind, but sweet I have buried my hatreds deep. My life is a long pathway which only you can keep. Night, night, divine and sad, a nomad moon wanders away. Nevermore will we be at night so sad, never can be. Your hands, give them to me. Let me speak, and simply words you cannot forget, we're alone.
It's a beautiful poem, right? It's just remarkable to think about all of this Black literature that we haven't translated yet, or in this case, translated well, right? That we know nothing about in his story. I love that, the way you begin, she begins the book, you begin the book, is, just talking about looking for this translation of this poem. And then gently, page over page, you unveil the story about this man being, taken to Fort Dimanche, which is sick, Fort Sunday, right? And under the Duvalier dictatorship and never seen again, right? It's just that story of all of these people who were lost to us. So as you've heard in the introduction, Danticat has written so many brilliant books and awarded so many multiple well-deserved prizes over and over again. whenever she publishes a book, it's a huge literary event, and this book is no exception. You're also exceptionally well-read in multiple languages. I love the Madeline thing, by the way. I want to talk to you about that. Anybody read Madeline as children? Yes, exactly. Amazing that, you know, my book is Ferdinand. My Madeline is Ferdinand. And it's just amazing how children at certain time periods could walk themselves into texts that they were not supposed to be inside of. That's what I'm thinking about the Madeline, you know. Anyway, so you're well-read in multiple languages and count as your dearest friends some of the most powerful writers living today, like you. And yet, there's a quiet but poignant passage. And this is what we just talked about in the book where you write that your best writing teachers were the storytellers of your childhood. You just spoke about that a little bit. There are many almost inarticulable gifts that come from being a woman writer. There are also just as many curses. The most common, I think, is not having your mind taken very seriously. Women writers' work is lovely, while books by men are powerful. It's so fucking ridiculous. One of the gestures I admire most, though, in your work is how you begin your books. Every last book, they're quiet and calm in that way. Yes, a hurricane can be calm before it arrives. And so what's waiting for us in this book, as I said, is after you've lured us in, is a deeply researched, interventionist nonfiction collection that is both lyrical, personal, as Ms. Strand said, but most of all, politically and historically relentless. And you don't expect it from, you know, Edwidge is so like, hi. But meanwhile, it's like, oh my God. So you remind us, for example, that at the beginning of the outbreak of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, Haitians were on the CDC's list for high-risk transmission. Haitians, homosexuals, these are quotes, hemophiliacs, and intravenous drug users. And you know that Haitians were the only population defined as nationally at risk. We'll come back to this. I'm telling you, I was not ready for it. There's another moment in the book where you describe being caught in a flood with your family after a hurricane. You then follow that passage with this river of language itself that describes the history of Europe and US involvement in Haiti. For example, on the crest of Haiti's independence, France's despicable, egregious requirement that Haiti pay France for the money it would lose if slavery ended. Do you guys know about this? Good, I'm glad to hear that. A lot of people don't know. So I'll move on, but literally newly independent Haiti had to pay France to get their bodies out of hock, basically, with all its rhetoric of fraternité, liberté, égalité, etc. France doesn't like to talk about this debt, but Danticat reminds us that what was then $150 million at the time is now worth $30 billion today. And all I could think about is, what if Haiti had $30 billion, right? Pumped into its infrastructure. In another passage, you remind us that 200,000 Haitians were killed in the 2010 earthquake. 200,000. And that 13 crimes against humanity were perpetrated in Haiti in 2018. I could go on and on and on, obviously, because this book has really rocked me. I've read it now 3 times. And I'm aware that this is a long summarization, but I do so in order to remind you all, and me too, of your intellectual rigor. And all the while, all of this is braided and balanced within remarkably written prose. So can we talk about a bit about your political and historical projects, Edwidge?
I think because even speaking, talking about Roland Chassagne, who is not like in the pantheon of like political Haitian writers, he would not come up, yet still had this end that was related to politics. But Haitian literature it's a very complicated, very complex, and very layered literature, but has a very strong history of engaged, like we call engagé writers, from Jacques Romain to Jacques-Stéphane Alexis. So I think I was just recently at the Harlem Book Fair with some younger writers, and even folks who don't want their writing to be a political project, you get pulled into it today.
Yeah.
Most of the day I was talking to some relatives I have in Springfield, Ohio, because all over the news, thanks to like J.D. Vance and Elon Musk, is that yes, they're saying, oh, Haitians are eating cats in Ohio, right? And it's
What?
like, yes, this is like the most recent sort of like xenophobic, anti-blackness projected on Haitian bodies from the 80s with the issues of AIDS to it's in the Times. Like the Times, there was some pushback. At least like we were reading with friends, we were like, at least there's like the people who are reporting are saying it's untrue. The people in that city are saying they had no reports, but it's being used as sort of like, it's like this anti-immigration like.
God.
It's very hard, like, it's very hard not to have a political project, to be like, I just want to write about the beach, I want to write about the flowers. It's very hard not to have a political project when so much of this xenophobia, so much of the anti-blackness, so much of this history of intervention that this continues is constantly part of your life. Like, I mean, this very day, this moment that I'm speaking to you right now.
Yeah, I'm going to go off script a little bit. I'm thinking of you watching your mother leave Haiti in the airport. You talk about it in this book, you talk about it in other books. I think about that a lot when I think about your work, right? That rupture. And it's all because of politics, right? Always.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, that's the way too that I think one of the things that I try to revisit in some ways in the work is just that the very close to the skin way that the political affects us, and that's true. I think in a lot of, it's not a luxury that we have to have complete distance from it.
I mean, yeah, and sure, but it's amazing how you can go from something about Papa Doc Duvalier into. Right, this personal thing, it's an incredible gift that I think you have, right? Where the political and the historical is engaged without apology and tersely even at times, but the language is so taut that I, as a reader, we're alone, I'm willing to follow you anywhere in those moments.
Thank you.
So how does patriarchy, and speaking of politics, how does patriarchy and misogyny affect your work, if at all?
Don't they affect all our work?
I don't want to put words in your mouth, Edwidge. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Patriarchy, misogyny, misogynoir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of part of the whole massive mountain that we must climb.
Do you fight with it aesthetically when you're alone? God, I'm going to just keep making jokes. I'm sorry, mom jokes. We were laughing about it.
Yeah, we were making jokes about it.
But do you fight? Do you fight it, or is the fight over for you aesthetically?
I don't. I think I wrestle all my demons on the page.
Yeah, yeah.
So if anything, I mean, there are many ways. Like as you know, like there are many ways to present things. So I write essays so I don't get too preachy in my fiction, for example.
Oh, that's fascinating. Aren't you glad I asked that question? That's fantastic.
So I'm like, at least I want to have that outlet, because when I'm writing, even though I think those things get manifested and they get displayed in the fiction because they're just part of life.
Yeah.
But when I'm writing my fiction, I was like, I want to really tell an engaging story. I don't want to, I don't know if, do you remember like the Wayans brothers? I'm old enough to like remember.
I remember the Wayans brothers.
Having loved the Wayans brothers.
Love them.
They used to do these spoofs of popular movies.
Yeah.
And there was one. There were scenes when they would show like something really heavy happening, and then a Wayans brother would pop up and go, "Message."
Yeah.
So I really want to avoid that, like in my fiction. So,
But it's so
so I
fascinating.
try to do the message.
It's so fascinating what you just said, though, that you use essays, the genre, as a way to clean out this kind of didactic, beat your readers over the head from your fiction. That's incredible. It reminds me of this story. In fact, one of the last times I was here, I was on the stage with Claudia Rankine. And Claudia and I were talking about, not on the stage, but how, everybody thinks Claudia is this experimental, avant-garde writer. And I was like, how do you get that prose so clean? She goes, oh, I drop it in a sonnet. And then I put it back in a paragraph. So you're
But
actually,
that's experimental, though.
I know,
Yeah.
but you're actually reading sonnets when you're reading Rankine. I mean, it's just interesting to think about these tools. And so, I mean, the flip side of patriarchy and misogyny is I wonder how does being a woman writer allow you access to certain intellectual or aesthetic terrain, if at all? Is it the same question?
It is a similar question. I mean, I think I had the woman writer thing with, I think for us, I'm saying from my particular experience, my particular community, it's sometimes woven in with class, kind of like where you come from, what's your last name. I think, there's sometimes people who I think are seen to be as natural heirs to being writers. Yeah. There were no writers in my family. I didn't know a lot of, I come from, like there's a chapter in the book, They're Waiting in the Hills. I come from the people of the hills. Yeah. And so I don't think that's something, like my parents didn't expect that for different reasons, but I think sometimes when I would show up places, people were like, oh, where did you grow up? And I would say like writers didn't typically come from where I grew up. And also when I just came out, I presented I was very young, when Birth Eyes Memory was coming out. So
how old were you?
I was 24.
Oh my God.
So I would show up to places and we have so people I would go on come up for things and people would say, Tifia, the girl. So, and then, I didn't have the words yet, yet to be like, I'm not a girl. Yeah. But I think that all of that, I think, was woven into, class was woven into, age was woven into it. And so then I had to also learn how to, to just also not participate in my own, demeaning. Yeah. Which is something at 55, I still struggle with, right?
Did you hear what she just said? Yeah. That's amazing, yeah. Well, it's also, you can feel it in the way you write in this book. There's incredible authority, but the authority is so vulnerable and intimate at the same time. It's just, it's a lesson. It's a lesson to watch you at work.
And it's kind of, I get that feeling reading you too. It's a journey, right? It's a journey, and as you go through it, you're like, I hope I come on the other end of what I'm doing with some more wisdom.
Yeah. Any artists or writers in the room? Yeah. I always tell my students that the longest journey I've ever taken, and I've lived all over the world, traveled all over the world, is from my bed to my desk. That is the longest journey I've ever been on, and it's a very hard one, So I'm gonna just flip a little bit back to the political work that you're doing in this book, the intervention. I was I'm embarrassed to say, very shocked to read about the history of Guantanamo Bay. So Danticat does this amazing kind of gift of reminding us about Gitmo and George Bush and 9/11, and that there were 780 people from 48 countries. This is not in the book, but I'm just reminding us because it's important to remember. 780 persons from 48 countries were detained in Guantanamo Bay after 9/11, most without charge. 9 died in custody, and 30 people still remain in prison today, decades later, in cages, still force-fed and held without charge. But this is what's interesting about your book and what you keep doing. I mean, that's interesting, don't get me wrong, I'm sorry. Not interesting, that's a horrible word. That's very important. But what's kind of revelatory about what you're doing in this book is that then Danticat talks about the history of Guantanamo Naval Prison itself and tells us as the reader, as she proceeds deeper into the site, that before 9/11, Guantanamo was used in the 1990s to detain over 40,000 Haitian asylum seekers. They were kept behind barbed wire in 4-foot square cages. HIV-positive asylum seekers were also detained there, including over 200 additional Haitian nationals. So, I mean, I don't know if this is even a question, Edwidge. It's more like a bow down to you for being willing to go ever deeper. But if possible, can you describe how you digest or integrate this constant erasure of Haitian history from popular and historical discourse?
I mean, I think that's one of the things that I wanted to thread through in these essays, and I think of them as braided essays, right? Like you don't end up where you think you're going. And part of, when I came to the U.S. at 14, at 12, but at 14, my dad, they were the first group of Haitian refugees and asylum seekers coming to New York. And my dad was in this church where they would, on Sundays, go visit folks, and I would go with my parents. And the people would, often they would give you notes. They would say, I was on the boat, my parents don't know if I made it, and then, call this number. And people like my parents would, would take them, and then the church were one of the places that people landed. And so just like, and then there were these stories of so they would give the men as lotions, they would give them these basically scabies oil, and just like, and the food they were feeding them, the men were growing breasts, and they sued the government, but that it was this very long journey, and Guantanamo was part of that in the 90s after the coup d'etat against President Aristide, where all these people were coming by boat were held on Guantanamo, and Guantanamo actually was, I think, like a practice, I guess that was their practice for what followed. But it's really, it's mostly, I remember wanting to write that essay when there were those images of the people on horseback whipping the Haitian refugee, like the Haitian asylum seekers on the border in Del Rio. And to a lot of people, including young people in my family, it was new. They thought it was sort of this one-shot thing, and it's like, and I really wanted to kind of trace that line for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible gift that this book gives the world, is that tracing, right? And and like I said, you just never see it coming. I was thinking, yay, thank you, Edwidge, for reminding us about Guantanamo. And then I just truly did not know this history, I'm embarrassed to say, but I didn't know it. Probably didn't know about it because nobody probably taught it to us. We were having this conversation in the back. So in the book, you also, I'm gonna kind of flip over in different places. I'll come back to this in a minute. But you also discuss Garcia Marquez. And this is kind of related, right? And the problematic projection of magical, for those of you guys who are literary folks, also known as magical realism, as an adjective to describe his aesthetic. You also write about your father, for example, and that he was a Pentecostal deacon, and your uncle was a minister. And so, that projection of magical is deeply problematic. So I just want to ask you, how does religion, philosophy, indigenous theologies, and even existentialism inform your work?
I think very, very deeply, because where I grew up in Haiti, like in a neighborhood called Bel Air, there was my uncle who's, who also, who grew up in the mountains but came to the city, which was a very common migration for folks, and started this church. And then next door was a Pays Style, which was a Vodou temple. and we were like not supposed to go, but of course that makes you wanna go more. But there was still a coexistence, and we knew when the feast days were, and they knew when the church days were, and to have seen that, like sort of that coexistence in our neighborhood, like listening to what the cohort, which was the religious songs, but also at the same time we were listening for days on to songs that were sang during the Vodou ceremonies. So I'm very curious also. I mean, I'm very certainly marked by just the common threads in both religions, in both these practices. Growing up for me was this idea that this is not all there is.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we can easily, that is natural weaving into art, right? That there's something beyond for my parents, for my uncle, it was like you're going to heaven. For my neighbors, it was like Ubalna Guinea, which means a return to Africa, on a different kind of ship than the kind that brought us here. But it was all of it, both of it was just like, there's this circularity to life that was important. So I think that's probably the most important way it marks my work and my interest in sort of like exploring mortality and this idea of like how we see what comes after, how we prolong life in the way that, I mean, literature is certainly one way, right? Yeah. Like Roland Chassagne's life is prolonged by this poem that found its way to me. Yeah. And that I think is also a kind of spiritual practice, a kind of prayer, if you will.
Yes, and now it's prolonged even more because it's in this book. So this man who was killed in this camp is now, present. I ask because there's this kind of like liturgical resonance in your syntax, right? In the way that you kind of play with sounds. I mean, a lot of poets admire Edwidge because she has this kind of poetic assonance underneath your sentences that we really appreciate. So I want to talk about Black writers because you talk about them a lot. And it's a really surreal thing if you guys travel all over the world. For me at least, when I've lived all over the world, to just suddenly hear people talking about the profound kind of inspiration that Black Americans and the history that's been enacted here for the last 4 centuries in terms of abolitionism and civil rights movement and the arts movement have played. I mean, even when I lived in India or everywhere. I mean, I've never gone anywhere where people weren't like, let's talk about African American kind of resistance as a method of inspiration. I know that's true for a lot of people, also in the diaspora. And so as surreal as US history is, and it is, I wonder if you can just talk about what Black writers did for you in terms of your craft, because it seems like you were, especially there, you guys, if you want to hear someone talk about Toni Morrison in these very profound ways, you have to read this book. There's a whole passage about Morrison in here. But I just wonder about, in general, how Black writers have, American writers. Yeah.
Well, I think, again, I've been working my way up to kind of like expressing this great love because, so in Create Dangerously, I talk about the Haitian writers who were the love of my life, or still the love of my life. And this, I go back to 11th grade. I had a history teacher, Mr. Casey, who was so devoted. It's kind of like the kind of teacher you want to be. Yeah. So we had an elective that was on our lunch hour, and I remember I told him, he asked me what I wanted to do when I was older. I said, I want to be a writer. And so he gave me Mary Evans, that anthology of Black women writers, 1950 to like the 70s. And it's this very big book. And I started reading it. It has work by the writers, but also the writers talking about their work. And I mean, from that day, I've like obsessed with writer interviews. And so I started reading. I read Toni Morrison. That's the first place I read Rootedness, that essay where she talks about. And now I teach a class that is based around that essay. It's where she wonders what what it's like to write in the presence of an ancestor. And I thought, wow, that's, and everybody, like you can imagine, was in that. And I tore through that book, and then it suddenly opened for me with Black women writers, like, oh, this is possible, And Langston Hughes I came across when I read like a translation of Jacques Roumain's Masters of the Dues, which is a canonical Haitian text, and that he had translated with Mercer Cook. And the first book I read in English was Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And I remember, like, I picked it out. I read that with a dictionary, and I could, like, Birth Eye's memory would not exist without I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, because I remember reading that thinking, wow, like, you can do that? Like, you can say these things? Like, and then, and when I was in college, I went to something, and Maya Angelou was there, with the voice, and I'm like, wow, like, she wrote that, and there was no shame, right? She was glorious, and there was I was like, so for me, it was just extraordinarily liberating. Today, Alexis Pauline Gumbs always does this thing, wonderful scholar who just wrote a biography of Audre Lorde, where she says, called people in the room who are not there to, we should call Sonia Sanchez. Today's her 90th birthday. We were watching a little bit of her celebration backstage. I found her in that book, and then to go, it's like that extraordinary thing that I think sometimes we might underestimate. For me, to this day, it's striking to read somebody and then to see them and they're like, oh, they look normal. They look like they look like like it's sort of like the work, and it's pretty amazing. So, and then I had and Paul Marshall for me bridged that gap, because often like people might tell you could be Caribbean or you could be African American. And writers like Audre Lorde and Paul Marshall were both. And I got a chance to know her a little bit and to know Ms. Morrison a little bit, and that was just like an extraordinary gift.
Yeah. I love what you're saying. Can you guys come here if I don't use the mic? No? Okay, that's okay. I love what you're saying about modeling, like aesthetic modeling and language. I will never forget, the first book I ever read by Toni Morrison was Tar Baby, and I was still in high school, and I was in a high school here, and the high school was horrible in terms of literature, and my English teacher was even more horrible. She was so racist. I mean, you guys, I'm just telling you, if you didn't grow up in LA, in these schools at a certain time, it was just out and out abuse. And so I had never read a Black person or a person of color, K through 12. And were it not for my parents, I would never have read it, anything like that. I didn't even know that there were Black writers in the world. I didn't know. And that it was really possible to go through LAUSD and have that experience. So Toni Morrison published Tar Baby, and some woman in a bar tried to pick me up. And she was like, why don't you come with me to go see Toni Morrison? And I was like, who's he? I was maybe 16, maybe 15, I can't remember. Anyway, and we went. And I was like, right, just listening to anybody read Tar Baby, it's my favorite book of hers still. Also, Cornel West and I used to argue about this in graduate school. I was like, it's the best book, I'm telling you. But anyway, in this book, I remember the moment I saw Toni Morrison. She does something, something, something. I don't even know what's happening in the book. And then, period, then Naw, N-A-W, period. It shattered my entire world. I still think about it all the time. And also, she had no dialogue markers in that book, no quotations. Just, I mean, some, but no, he said, she said. It was just on fire. And I stayed up, my sister's in the audience, I just noticed, I stayed up all night long reading the book, and 7 hours later, I was a new person. Wow. And I was like, I don't know why I thought this, I can do that. Language. Oh,
I mean, we see that all the time. Shange with with Paulo and Stamba,
Absolutely.
where she's like, I mean, in a way that it's like the fighting against, like,
Yeah.
you know, and there's just goings on Neil Hurston for everybody.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean that thing of permission of what's of
Yeah.
the possibilities. Yeah, and it's great that you love Tar Baby, because I think
Ugh.
it's a more neglected. We were at a Toni Morrison conference this summer in Martinique, and they paired her with Césaire. It was like a conference about
nice.
Aimé
Wow.
Césaire and Toni
Wow.
Morrison.
Wow.
And I realized someone pointed it out. I was, you know, I talked because we were in the like
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Martinique,
yeah.
and someone pointed out that J.D. the character reads Césaire.
Totally,
So,
that book.
yeah.
Toni Morrison also was a huge fan of literature from the continent. That's how I found out about Kamara Leigh and all these other people. Are we out? Okay, can I ask just 2 more quick questions? Okay, wait, let me just think. Do you first write in English or in French or Creole or some other language, and why?
I first write in I write in English mostly because I came here when I was 12, and that was my it's my writing language.
That's so fascinating, right? I don't want this conversation to end. I'm skipping 4 other questions. I've always been in awe of your work, Edwidge, always. I remember, anybody old enough to remember when her first book came out? Shook the whole literary landscape, and it always does. And so it's an honor to sit and talk again. I want to end our discussion with one last question. Early on in the book, you say that you believe that being human means having to keep beginning again. It's such an incredible, again, these quiet moments that you line up, stack up against this political and historical history, right? So being human means having to keep beginning again. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the most obvious interpretation, of course, but I think when you think of it in terms of migration too, which is an issue that I try to broach, like from a personal perspective in the book as well, is that how much is sacrificed for these new beginnings, you know? And I even got to that point because I was at a writing workshop for young people in Haiti, and you know, it was a really interesting task that the person who was doing the workshop said, okay, you begin like this, why? Like, why do you begin? And then I just thought, you know, and also thinking of Maya Angelou, who was like, you know, writing is always beginning, you're always like restarting, but also thinking about like this new beginnings that we hope for, you know, that my parents hoped for when they came here, that these parents who are, you know, going to the border now, crossing the Darien Gap, and all these beginnings that these new beginnings that they're hoping for their future, for their children, and that you're getting demonized for, but human beings have been migrating from the beginning of time.
Absolutely.
In search of these new beginnings. So, I mean, I think it's one of the more optimistic things about new beginning is that it's part of being human.
Yeah. This is a new beginning. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Such an honor, such an honor. I think we're
Thank
going to
you.
do
You're-
Q&A, yes?
You're a
Tiffany?
goddess.
Yes, if you have a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will come to you.
Hi. Thank you so much for all that you shared. And I'm wondering, who do you think of when you think of who you write for? How much do you think of your people in the hills, and how much has that changed over time?
Well, I mean, that's thank you for the question. I mean, from my very first book, I was fully aware of sort of the limitations of where I am, what language I write in, and I don't think, you know, some might disagree that it's different for even writers who are in Haiti who write in French, because there are many obstacles to people getting access to your work, from like the price of the books to literacy. So, but when I'm writing, I think, if I think of the greater world, it's still a bit intimidating to me. So I always think of the 15-year-old girl I was who was in the Brooklyn Public Library looking for like something that was both, as they say, both a window and a mirror for me. So I think about her, and then I think about my nieces and nephews who may not know everybody in our family, who may not know Haiti at all. So those are like, I keep myself in that range. And my family members, you know, when I've gone back, like actually in Create Dangerously, I talk about this. When I would go to see my family members in the countryside, they called me. They would say journaliste, they called me a journalist, like, and that led to all kinds of things. And sort of like they're like, don't write about me, don't write about that.
Yeah, every January 11th, which is the anniversary of the opening of the Guantanamo torture camp, I organize a Close Guantanamo rally in front of the downtown Los Angeles Federal Building. I don't know what part of the U.S. you live in, but if you're in Southern California, we'd love to have you next time.
Thank you very much for that. I live in New York now, but I'm glad to know that there are still efforts for that, because the conversation always goes back, right? You know, are we closing it, or are we not closing it? So I'm glad that people are still thinking about Guantanamo and the folks who are there.
Hi, you mentioned something earlier about like being Haitian versus like being, you know, Black and as a writer. For me, coming from Memphis, when I went to college, that was my first time dealing with ethnicity. I feel ignorant to say that, to me, people are Black or white or Mexican. And so when I got to college and people were more identifying with their ethnicity, it was shocking to me. But from your perspective, do you have a moment where you realize like you were identifying maybe as Haitian primarily, and then you're like taking on Blackness, or was when you came here at 12, was that the same thing to you?
Oh, no, I never had one of those things like I realized I was Black when. No, I never had that. Because I'm from the world's first Black republic. So, like, I was just like, no, I was always Black. I was born Black. I'm going to die Black. But I think, like, when I talk about these writers who bridge, because then I was thinking, like, for me, coming across Paul Marshall, it was just to see these writers who were writing also about the Caribbean, and were also writing about what it was like to be in Brooklyn, right? For like in Brown Girl, Brownstone, and you know, Praise Song for the Widow, and where she merges this idea of like the ring shout, which is very, you know, Southern American, with, and we could see it as like a kind of you know, of a trance, like Zora Neale Hurston, who traveled to Haiti. So for me, I was always looking for these kinds of middle places where we can meet, because that's already, like, that was already happening in our families here, you know, with, and again, my nieces and nephews will have these Pan-African, like Pan-diasporan, like, experiences and lineage. So I was really searching for that in the literature, where, and I found it very, very powerful. And I found that there were things that, in addition to these writers who were kind of Caribbean American, like Paul Marshall and Audre Lorde, and now you have writers like Roxane Gay who, you know, who bridge that. So that to me is just really fascinating, how that's emerging in the ways that and then Langston Hughes did it, and translating, you know, this Haitian novel and traveling to Haiti. It's been done already, but I was just always excited to see ways that it was sort of manifesting in my time. Yeah.
We have time for one more.
I was gonna say, Robin, you said there were 4 questions you had that you skipped, so maybe you could pick one of those.
I love you so much right now. let me just have a quick look. But one thing I was thinking about your question is, for me, I mean, partly, do you mind if I don't ask those for questions and instead I say this? Because it's related to what you just said, and I think it's really important in terms of African diasporic literature and diasporic literature in general. For me, reading Black writers from the French Caribbean was a huge liberation. My family's from Louisiana. My father spoke very broken Creole. You know, French, Spanish colonization of Louisiana is deeply problematic. And, you know, all the bantering back and forth. And I felt like when I started reading Black writers who wrote in French, even if it was in translation, I started to understand my family, and particularly my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents. How did French colonialism in the United States, which we don't talk enough about, look for them? I just started understanding things I could only kind of sense as a child. And I think that Black writers worldwide, right? And I deeply suggest, if you haven't already, reading everything from the continent, everything from the Caribbean. I mean, post-colonial Black literature is a thing of sublime power and beauty, just exquisite. And I just read, I ate the Heinemann, right, Heinemann Publishers.
I love
I
those.
ate the Heinemann reading list, publisher list. Like, I mean, I can't tell you how many books I just read and read and read. And so this question, for writers about like Blackness, it was never, just not a question. It was like, basically, what did they do to you over there? And also, you know, here's how we came to ourselves through language. The other thing I want to just point out again that I think cannot be ever understated or overstated is that what Edwidge just said about I come from the first Black republic in the world. 1804. 1804. Let's stop there.
We'll end. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Robin.
Thanks for coming.
Thank
Should
you
I
both.
tell, is anyone going to tell?
Oh, no. Thank you both so much, really. That was fantastic. Thank you. So Edwidge will be signing her books in the lobby, and I believe there are some of Robin's books as well, and she will be signing as well. So please come into the lobby and meet them and have them sign their books. And also, we have our first review on the 22nd, Sunday the 22nd of September, which is banned books with word theater. So there'll be a lot of really terrific actors reading from banned books. So we hope to see you all there. Take care.